Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show produced by InsideInvestigator.org. We're a nonprofit newsroom where we produce investigative journalism to root out corruption in Connecticut. My name is Conner Drigotas. I'm the managing editor here, and today I'm joined by Katherine Revello, investigative reporter and transparency expert. I don't know if I'm overstating that, Katherine, but I certainly think that you are best of the best when it comes to FOIA and transparency. So I want to get into that a little bit today, but I also want to talk first about your newest investigation. It's called Ratioed: How Connecticut Licensing Laws Contribute to the Construction Worker Shortage. And I guess to frame this up a little bit before I have you get into some of the details, housing has been a discussion in Connecticut for as long as Inside Investigator has been around. And certainly, I think for years before that. I mean, this is something that is being discussed at the state level. It's being discussed locally. People are, at odds or in agreement, building alliances with their neighbors over the topic. I mean, there's a lot to unpack human wise. But what you, I think, identified here is, man, there's a bigger problem going on here that kind of transcends the ability of people to sort out these problems. So I'll leave it at that for now. But what the heck is going on, and who thinks they can fix it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think a lot of people think they can fix this, but there's just really been no impetus at the state level to actually get a bill through. And, I think we all know there are housing issues. There's housing shortages. Housing is expensive right now. And a big portion of that is because there's a supply issue. There's just not enough housing to go around, and we're not building enough housing. And part of the reason that that occurs is because there is an issue with the construction workforce in Connecticut. And Connecticut has an older construction workforce than other areas. New England and the Northeast in particular have this issue, but Connecticut is even slightly higher than that. And what we found with this investigation is that, there are different levels to licensure, and that's, a whole different ball of wax. But within construction licensure, Connecticut has not just, a requirement for apprentices and, the way that they have to get certified, but for construction firms that want to hire apprentices to help them with their workload, there are even more requirements. Connecticut has a ratio for apprentices. And the way that basically works is if you're a construction firm and you have three licensed professionals, so either a journeyman or a contractor, for the first three apprentices that you want to take on, it's basically a 1-to-1 ratio. But after that, it's a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you want to hire, if you have three apprentices and you want to hire another one, you first have to hire three additional licensed journey people or contractors. And obviously that's a big burden, especially if you're, a smaller construction firm and you just can't handle that. And what this means, according to some of the experts that we talked to in this article, is that, apprentices aren't getting hired, which, is not only bad right now when we have, housing shortages and construction worker shortages, but long term is also not good for the industry because it means that as people are aging out of it, they're not being replaced by younger workers because there's just not that availability. And, in reality, Connecticut's a small state. It's very easy to cross the border, so Connecticut is losing out in competition to surrounding states that don't have this requirement.
So you're bringing up, I guess, two basic realities. One, that pesky supply and demand chart, right? But then also, we live in this world of finite resources, which makes it tough, and it's not unreasonable that people seek out opportunities without wanting to, without having to jump through hoops. If something's easier, you're right, small state. Let me play devil's advocate for a second, and I'm curious to hear what the landscape says. This is a safety thing, right? This is about making sure that there are, the highest standards are there for the best construction to happen, to elevate. Is it a quality argument, I guess, that's being made? Or, why are these ratios in place?
Well, that's the interesting thing is nobody seems to know why they exist, right? We talked to Representative Tim Ackert, who is a licensed electrician, I believe, and has a lot of experience in this area and is an outspoken critic of this law. And according to him, this is a law that most people agree isn't great. Even if you're making a safety argument for it, other states don't have this requirement. There are already a lot of requirements to become a licensed apprentice and to work. So this is not just a basic safety requirement. This is in addition to other requirements.
Mm.
So nobody, even though most people agree this isn't great, nobody's really sure why it exists, especially since other states around us don't have it. And there have been, efforts to try to reform it, to get rid of it, to, make it work better. And there really hasn't been, bills have come up and they haven't gone anywhere. So there were a lot of frustrations around that with some of the people that we talked to for this article.
I know this is an investigation that didn't start with the construction worker shortage. We get a lot of tips about occupational licensing generally. I think there's very clearly a lot of frustration when people are trying to open businesses or engage in any kind of commerce that, you know, they don't want to have to jump through all those hoops for. Uh, could you share a little bit about how we ended up going from this much broader topic and what ended up being, I think in the end, pretty granular? I mean, this really dug in on something very specific.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was, an interesting one to write because I had not heard of this requirement before, even though I'm pretty familiar with a lot of occupational licensing requirements, a lot of, the pro and the con arguments about how occupational licensing creates barriers to entry, how it, adversely impacts, specific groups of people, which was kind of the angle that we started out with wanting to write this was, if you were, we're lucky, we're journalists. The First Amendment protects us from having to get occupational licensure. Most people don't have that constitutional amendment that protects them, and if you happen to work in an occupation or an industry that does require licensure, there are sometimes prerequisites for education, there's tests, there are background checks, there are all these different requirements that, you have to pay for and invest your time in. And so what we initially really wanted to focus on was, what exactly does that cost? If you look at, add all of that stuff up, in terms of the licensure requirements, in terms of the actual license that you not only have to get, but keep reapplying for, and look at what your average salary is expected to be, how much time are you spending essentially working for the state every year? And we ended up stumbling upon people who were specifically complaining about how Connecticut's occupational licensing requirements for construction workers particularly impact that industry, especially because I believe New York doesn't actually require any kind of licensing. So again, it's that competition, supply and demand thing. And once we started talking to people about that industry, they mentioned, hey, there's this ratio requirement that's, a real constriction on us that nobody else has. So we ended up uncovering something that, you know, ended up being a great focus for this article.
Little laboratories of democracy unpacking here to see what's going to work and what isn't going to work. To what extent did the folks that you talked to kind of attribute, again, this is a long-standing issue. It's something that's been going on for a long time, but housing has come up year after year. Is this kind of where a lot of people lay this at construction, or is there somewhere else that is also, I guess, could you help elaborate on that? To what extent is this issue the core, or is this just one of many issues in the housing space?
Yeah, I think it's hard to pick out a core issue because there are so many interconnected issues when it comes to housing. Obviously, supply is a big issue, and I think it's been the focus of a lot of talks about housing reform and building, excuse me, more housing in recent years. But what I don't think has been addressed as much is yes, there's a housing supply and demand issue, but there's also a construction workforce supply and demand issue, and construction workers are who are building the houses. So I don't know that it is the definitive issue, but I think it is an important issue and it's an under talked about issue.
Absolutely. I'll point folks back to an investigation from January 2023 as well. If you're interested in housing and the affordable housing debate, Mark had done a piece January 22nd, 2023, called Zoning In When Affordable Housing Came to Brookfield, that looks at another angle of the housing debate and what's going on in Connecticut. That I think both of these pieces really go together well. I'd love to even link them on the website if we can, right? They're not actually a series, but I think if we can do more to help readers understand that broader context, especially over time, that's part of us doing our job well, not necessarily from a reporting standpoint, but just from a I don't know, ease of technology standpoint. I feel like Joe and I are always trying to figure out new ways to uh, connect those dots and weave a comprehensive, understandable web for readers to navigate our website. It turns out there's a lot of news out there. So if we
Yeah.
aren't making it easy, people can get lost in whatever the newest headline is instead of getting an in-depth understanding, which, that's our mission. That's what we want to do. We think it's a key part of rooting out corruption. Um, I guess, do you want to talk about another key part here? Because we think about our mission as having different elements. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, we want to root out corruption through investigative journalism, but making it clear is one element of that, and transparency is another piece. And you had brought out this idea to dig a little deeper on the transparency work that we are doing, which I just gave two thumbs up to as soon as you brought it up. I feel like it was just such a fantastic thing because there's so much going on behind the scenes. Uh, it's called Transparency Update. And I guess walk me through and our listeners here through why did you think it important to start sharing what's going on behind the scenes when it comes to transparency?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, we talk about in-depth, we love doing in-depth pieces. Unfortunately, a lot of times that's really hard to do unless we have, somebody like a tipster who's providing us with documents, or more often than not, it means we need to go through FOIA and through the state's Freedom of Information Act. And I think we've documented a little bit on the fringes how difficult that has been, especially there are some agencies that are worse than others. And, while that's important, the Freedom of Information Act is about public records. It is about public access to public information. And a lot of times, because of the way that FOIA is administered and handled by agencies in Connecticut, that information isn't actually public. When people like me or you who uh, do these types of requests a lot and kind of know the ins and outs of the system and have resources like pro bono legal people we can talk to help us, or have the option to do things like go to the FOIC. That option's not available to everybody in Connecticut, and in my opinion that's a real problem, both from a transparency standpoint and from a number of other standpoints. And, we work on a lot of this stuff to begin with. And what Transparency Update is about is just talking more publicly about those issues that we're having with this work that we're already doing that doesn't necessarily fit into a hard news format. But just making sure that people are aware of what's going on, how hard we have to fight for some of these records, how that influences, I can think of probably a dozen stories that we've talked about doing that we can't do because we need FOIA or some other, insider information like that, that if agencies don't comply with that, we can't tell those stories. And in a lot of cases, there's wrongdoing that's going on. And so that's a problem. And so what this is about is trying to raise public awareness to what some of the issues with FOIA are, and also to provide a resource to people who might be interested with FOIA or are having issues with it. And we know there's a lot of stories of those because I cover the FOIC pretty regularly. Um, yeah, and just, making sure that people understand that we can be here as a resource. If you have a story that needs to be told, then, the transparency part of our mission, that's what we want to do.
That's such a key point, the element of supporting others who are interested in this, right? I mean, we're a small team. We clearly care deeply about this topic. We think it's vitally important as part of rooting out corruption. But the volume of people who reach out to us after reading one of your pieces and saying, "Hey, I'm experiencing something similar," we also hear it from other newsrooms, and I think that that is right in line with our mission as well. We want to play a role in improving investigative journalism generally. And I think I've said this before, probably even on the show, but we don't really have competition. We have potential future allies, right? We have other newsrooms that we would love to help them get more information. I mean, heck, we publish everything we create under a Creative Commons license, which means any newsroom can just take it, publish it, right? Please give us a backlink. But I really believe that Transparency Update, as you have laid it out, is a resource that can be used by other newsrooms, by reporters, by editors, but also the folks who are out there who don't even necessarily know what FOIA is. And that's, I think, one of the pieces that blows my mind about this whole thing is how frequently we get people who reach out and say, I wish I could get X, Y, or Z information. And when we say, have you requested it? They didn't even know that the process was there. Yes, are there problems downstream? Of course. And we want to help fix those. But there's definitely a public awareness campaign that's really valuable here. And I think if we can help people understand what some of those roadblocks are right from the get-go, they can avoid a lot of headache and heartache. Or probably the worst case scenario is when someone says, well, this system doesn't work. So that one FOIA ends up being their last because
Mm.
they don't believe that A, the system can be fought, but B, that they can win, that they can get this information to, you know, take care of their neighbors, their friends, their communities. I mean, that's really what I think FOIA is all about, is making sure that the watchman can be watched, right? That is our job as journalists generally. But we want to empower people. I mean, we've discussed this a little bit, but my understanding is that you would not only be willing, but would be excited if people reached out to you with FOIA questions to find resources. We are in the process of putting together videos, for example, of how to do FOIA requests. But part of that is we also need to understand where the information gaps are so we can serve you, dear listener, reader, watcher, wherever you're engaging in this program. We want to know what you need so we can provide it. I don't know if that's comprehensive enough, Catherine, for to kind of lay out an understanding of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I would think if you have a question about FOIA and you don't know whether you should reach out to it, I would reach out to us because, the worst we're going to tell you is we can't help you, but here's a resource that might be able to. Whether you don't know where to file a request, and I mean, I'm with you. I file requests almost every day, and there are so many agencies in the state that make it so difficult to figure out how to do that. They also passed a law last session that means that if you send it to the wrong place, they don't have to forward it. So, that's not fantastic either. But whether it's you don't know where to file a request, you don't know what language to use, you think there's some sort of information that you might be looking for, but you don't know where to start, or if you've had a really hard time with an agency and, you want someone to tell your story or someplace to vent to, I'm happy to do it. We've helped multiple people write requests before. It's something that we're happy to do.
And also, if you're already down the path to the point where you are getting stonewalled, we are interested in that as well. These are
Yeah,
battles that
we
we are
we
fighting.
wrote a story called Stonewalled
Yeah,
about one town not responding to FOIA requests. So if it's happening in your town, that's definitely news that we're interested in learning more about.
absolutely. And credit to you, because that investigation did result in greater transparency and the creation of clearer pathways to request information. So that was definitely a win. Um, we have a few more minutes here, and I want to, I guess, let if you have a interest in chatting about one of the three news stories that you've put out this week. One of them is probably the least interesting to talk about, but it has done the best. Connecticut cannabis prices continuing to fall. Google went bonkers for this one. They loved it. People keep clicking in. But then you also wrote two stories, one about a law requiring business registrations that is being temporarily on hold, and then finally an appeals court decision that revived a lawyer's conduct suit. Any of the three would be interesting to chat about, but which do you think would be most helpful for the folks in Connecticut to get a deeper look at?
Yeah, let's talk about the business registration law because
Mm.
this is something that I think has flown under the radar. This is a law that was actually passed in 2021, I believe. And, if you're a small business in Connecticut, you have under 20 employees, and the CBIA told us they believe something like 120,000 businesses are affected by this law. You are supposed to report information on who owns you to the federal government, which the organization that is managing this itself estimated this was supposed to cost billions of dollars to comply with. And, even if you're just a small, simple business, 90 minutes of your valuable time to fill out this information. Um, it has been put on hold temporarily pending a lawsuit because there are a bunch of business organizations that have said, hey, this is unconstitutional. Not only is it a burden for small businesses, but it's the federal government taking over what are traditionally state laws about how businesses need to be registered. And I think my favorite part of this story is it's, your typical, this is for financial security. There was financial terrorism thrown around when this bill was getting passed. But if you go onto the website for FinCEN, which is the part of the Treasury that's responsible for this, they've got a big alert about how businesses are facing scams about this. So, even though this is supposed to make us all safer, it's actually created, scams that are targeting businesses and making their information less safe. So, that's right on our homepage. I think that's an important story that I think people need to know about because it's going to affect a lot of people.
Something about good intentions and roads leading somewhere comes to mind here. Because, yeah, this law was intended to, quote, curb illicit finance, which it seems like it has just created more, necessitating further intervention, which that snowball is certainly a form of corruption. Truly, I mean, it's definitely getting in the way of non-corrupt interactions, which is in and of itself a problem. There is also, you mentioned in the article, a failure to comply cost. So this can get expensive if you aren't on top of it, right?
It can get expensive and you could potentially go to jail if you're not on top of it too, which seems like a pretty severe penalty for not reporting to the federal government who owns your business.
Right. And this impacts, I mean, so we're talking about over 100,000 Connecticut small businesses that this impacts. So I am glad that you chose this one to talk about because if you are listening to this, either you or likely your neighbor or hundreds of businesses in your community are affected by this, but there hasn't been much discussion on the topic either. So thank you for picking this out and bringing it into, I guess, the public discourse. We've talked about several things here. Katherine's investigation, her new work on Transparency Update, which comes out every other week, pulling back the curtain on the struggles and hopefully triumphs of her effort to increase transparency and the struggles in the FOIA process. We're talking about her news articles, 30,000-foot level, Katherine. Thank you for what you're creating. Truly, I really appreciate it. Of course, from a business perspective and a nonprofit perspective and fulfilling our mission, but also just as a public service, I really appreciate the way that you approach this job and truly embrace our mission in service to the people of Connecticut. So, I don't know. I like throwing that stuff out there because I think it's vitally important that people understand. I don't know. It's journalism by humans for humans. We wake up every morning, and whether we're sick, we got kid stuff going on. We're at our desks fighting the good fight here to root out corruption. Anything else that you want to add before we look to wrap up?
I don't think so. I'd just reiterate tips at insideinvestigator.org, Katherine at insideinvestigator.org. If you've got tips, if you've got story ideas, if you've got FOIA stuff, reach out to us and we'll review it and get back to you.
Absolutely. No guarantees of coverage, but I can absolutely guarantee that we read it, we talk about it, we discuss it, we debate it. There are a lot of competing priorities, but every single story gets brought up and gets a fair shake as they compete for our time. Katherine, thank you so much for taking your time today to chat here. Thank you, everyone who is watching, listening, and tuning in to Inside Investigator and this show. I'll throw out a quick plug that we are a nonprofit, so we survive and thrive exclusively through voluntary donations from readers and watchers like you. We would love to earn your support. I think, heck, throwing in a few bucks to help Katherine do the amazing work that she does is, man, you're going to get a return on your investment for sure. So the Q4, the end of the year, is a key time for us as we lay out some pretty ambitious projects for 2025. Head over to insideinvestigator.org, read all of her investigations, her work, her news coverage, and hit that donate button if you're feeling generous. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.